Before this story pulls you into the darkness, listen closely. If you're watching from anywhere in the United States, welcome to Canon of Darkness, where forgotten legends breathe again. Hit subscribe, like this video, and share it, because stories like this were buried for a reason. Now, let's begin. The gunshot came first, loud, clean, final. At exactly 9:30 in the evening, the doors of a dusty Texas saloon slammed open, and a man dressed in black stepped inside. The lanterns flickered. Conversations died mid-sentence. No one spoke. No one breathed. 60 seconds later, a man lay dead on the floor, with a hole between his eyes, and the stranger was gone. That single shot would haunt Texas for years. But the story didn't start in that saloon. It started long before, on a plantation soaked in silence and blood. In 1858, the Whittemore estate stood 40 miles west of Houston, wide fields of cotton stretching endlessly beneath a cruel sun. The land belonged to Henry Whittemore, a man who called himself colonel despite never serving a day in uniform. Titles were cheap in the South. Power was not. Whittemore owned land, he owned buildings, and he owned people. Among them was a woman named Abigail. She worked inside the main house, cooking, cleaning, obeying. But among the enslaved, she was known for something rare: kindness, and her voice. At night, when exhaustion crushed hope, Abigail sang soft hymns passed down through generations, songs about rivers, freedom, and a God who never forgot his children. Her son listened every night. She named him in secret, whispering it like a prayer into the dark. Zachariah, she told him. It meant God remembers. Zachariah didn't know much about God, but he remembered his mother's voice, and that was enough. His father was sold away when Zachariah was 3. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. That was how slavery worked. People vanished, and the world pretended they never existed. By age 5, Zachariah was already working, carrying water, running errands, sweeping paths outside the big house. The Whittemore children laughed as they threw stones at him. Crying earned him a beating. Running earned him worse. So he learned to stay silent. The man who enforced that silence was Thomas Birch, the plantation overseer. He carried a heavy whip threaded with metal, and he enjoyed using it. Some men punished to maintain order. Birch punished because it pleased him. Zachariah was 7 years old when everything ended. It was August. The heat was unbearable. Abigail slipped while carrying a milk jug across the polished dining floor. It shattered. Milk spilled everywhere. Mrs. Whittemore screamed, not from fear, from rage. Thomas Birch was summoned. Zachariah heard his mother cry out from behind the house. He ran without thinking. He rounded the corner just in time to see her tied to a wooden post, her back bare, the whip raised high. Colonel Whittemore watched. His wife fanned herself beneath a tree, calm, bored. 37 lashes. Zachariah counted every one. By nightfall, Abigail was dead. No funeral, no farewell. The next morning, Zachariah was sent to the fields. But something had changed. The boy who believed in songs and promises died beside his mother that day. What stood up in his place did not cry, and it never forgot. But Abigail's death was only the beginning, because the next cruelty would steal the last piece of Zachariah's heart and light a fire that would one day burn an empire to the ground. After his mother died, the plantation felt colder, not in temperature, but in spirit.
The fields were the same, the sun was the same, the whip still cracked the air. But for Zachariah, the world had narrowed into something sharp and dangerous. He was 7, but grief aged him faster than years ever could. Cotton work began before dawn and ended after sunset. His fingers bled daily, the fibers cutting into skin that never had time to heal. Overseers barked orders. Anyone who slowed was punished. Zachariah learned to work through pain, to let his hands move while his mind went somewhere far away, somewhere his mother's voice still existed. The scars on his back multiplied, but his eyes stayed steady. That unnerved men like Thomas Birch. Slaves were supposed to break. Zachariah didn't. By the time he turned 9, there was only one person left in the world he loved: Grace. His little sister followed him everywhere. She slept curled beside him on the dirt floor at night. When food was scarce, he gave her his portion. When older children tried to scare her, he stood in front of her without saying a word. Grace believed her brother could protect her from anything. She was wrong. One morning, a carriage rolled onto the plantation grounds. Clean wheels, polished wood. A man stepped down, wearing fine boots and a friendly smile. His name was William Crawford, a slave trader from Houston. To the owners, he was a businessman. To the enslaved, he was a thief of souls. Crawford walked through the quarters, inspecting bodies like livestock. He checked teeth. He pressed muscles. He asked prices. When he saw Grace, he stopped. "That one," he said casually. "How much for the girl?" Zachariah froze. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Colonel Whitmore negotiated like they were discussing cattle. The number meant nothing to Zachariah. $400. What mattered was the sound Grace made when men grabbed her arms. She screamed his name. He ran. An overseer struck him with a rifle butt. The world went black. When Zachariah woke, the wagon was gone. So was Grace.
No one told him where she was taken. No one cared. Slavery didn't bother with explanations. It erased people and called it business. That night, Zachariah didn't sleep. He added 2 names to the list forming inside his mind: Colonel Whitmore and William Crawford. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he knew something with terrifying certainty. One day, they would answer for this. The years dragged on. Hunger, work, whippings, silence. The only light left was Samuel. Samuel was his age, maybe a year older. Where Zachariah was quiet, Samuel smiled. Where Zachariah held rage inside, Samuel believed in endurance. He talked about freedom like it was inevitable, not a dream, but a destination. At night, they whispered plans, escape routes, north, west, anywhere but here. Samuel said hatred only chained a man deeper. Zachariah didn't argue. Hate was all he had left. In December of 1860, Samuel was caught stealing bread. Just bread. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He had given his food to a sick child. The punishment was announced publicly. All the slaves were gathered beneath a pecan tree. Colonel Whitmore spoke calmly, explaining that order had to be maintained. Then they hanged Samuel, slowly. Zachariah was forced to watch as his best friend suffocated, kicking at empty air. The body was left hanging for 3 days as a warning. On the 3rd night, Zachariah cut Samuel down and buried him with his bare hands. And when he stood up from that grave, something inside him made a final decision. He would not die there. Before sunrise, he ran. But freedom doesn't come gently, and by the fourth night, Zachariah would hear the sound that meant only one thing: the dogs were coming. Zachariah ran west with no plan, no food, and no idea what waited beyond the fence. The plantation disappeared behind him, swallowed by darkness, but its shadow followed every step. He moved at night, hiding during the day, guided only by the stars Samuel had once pointed out and the quiet promise he carried inside his chest. Freedom, he quickly learned, was not gentle. By the second night, hunger clawed at him so fiercely it blurred his vision. He drank from creeks and puddles, hoping the water wouldn't poison him. He ate berries he didn't recognize and prayed they wouldn't kill him. His feet blistered, his legs shook. Still, he kept moving west. On the fourth night, he heard it, a long, echoing bay that rolled across the land like a death song. The dogs. Slave catchers didn't hunt alone. They brought hounds trained to follow human fear, men who knew exactly how desperation smelled. Zachariah's chest tightened as the sound grew closer. He ran harder than he thought possible, lungs burning, heart pounding like it might burst through his ribs. But you can't outrun dogs. His strength gave out near a dry creek bed. He stumbled, fell, and tasted blood. The baying was louder now. He could hear horses, voices, laughter. Then he saw it. A narrow hole in the creek bank, half hidden by roots and dead leaves. Without thinking, Zachariah shoved himself inside. The earth scraped his skin as he squeezed into darkness so tight he could barely breathe. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Something crawled across his ankle. He swallowed his scream. Minutes later, the hounds arrived. Their snouts hovered inches from his hiding place. They howled in confusion as the water washed his scent away. Men cursed, horses stomped. After a long, terrifying stretch of time, the sounds faded. Zachariah stayed buried for hours. When he finally crawled out, the moon was setting. He was alive, and for the first time in his life, no one owned him. The wilderness didn't welcome him. It tested him. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Zachariah learned by nearly dying. He learned which plants fed him and which burned his throat. He learned to follow animals to water. He learned how to make traps, fires, and shelter from nothing. The land was brutal, but it was honest. No whips, no overseers, no one telling him he was less than human. Sometimes he met people, outlaws hiding from the law, traitors crossing borders, men who saw a lone black boy and thought easy profit. Twice they tried to capture him. Both times they failed. The first time he killed a man, his hands shook. The second time they didn't. With every close call, something inside him hardened. Fear turned into awareness. Pain turned into discipline. By 15, Zachariah was no longer a boy. Then one spring evening, half-starved and burning with fever, he stumbled into a canyon and collapsed beside a small fire. A man sat there, old, gray-haired, with a rifle across his knees and eyes that had seen too much death. "You look like you're planning to die," the man said calmly. "Not tonight," Zachariah whispered. The man studied him for a long moment, then tossed him food. "Good," he said. "Living is harder."
That man was Joaquin Esperanza, a ghost of the borderlands, a gunfighter who had survived wars, revenge, and regret. He saw something familiar in the boy's eyes, the same fire. That night, beneath a sky full of stars, Zachariah told his story for the first time. His mother, his sister, Samuel, the plantation, the names. When he finished, Joaquin spoke softly. "If you walk the road you're dreaming of, you won't come back the same." Zachariah stared into the fire. "I already didn't." And in that moment, a hunted child stepped onto a path that would turn him into something else entirely. Because the old gunfighter didn't just offer shelter, he offered training that would remake Zachariah into a weapon the world wasn't ready for. Joaquin Esperanza did not believe in mercy disguised as kindness. If he was going to save Zachariah, he would do it honestly, through pain, discipline, and truth. The first lesson began before sunrise. Joaquin woke him by dumping cold water over his head. "If someone wants you dead," he said, "they won't wait for you to be ready." From that morning forward, life became a test that never stopped. The canyon became Zachariah's classroom. Joaquin taught him how to listen to the land, how birds fell silent before danger, how dust shifted under unseen feet, how the wind carried sound. Zachariah learned to move without leaving tracks, to disappear into rock and shadow. Survival wasn't strength, Joaquin said. It was awareness. Then came pain. They fought every day. Hands, knives, sticks, anything could be a weapon. Joaquin broke Zachariah down again and again, not out of cruelty, but necessity. "If your body doesn't fail here," he said, "it won't fail when death is watching." Nights were quiet. Fires burned low. Zachariah cleaned his wounds and stared into the flames, thinking of names he never spoke aloud. Hate stayed inside him, but it was changing, sharpening, becoming patient. The second year brought guns.
Joaquin placed 2 revolvers in Zachariah's hands like they were sacred objects. "A weapon is honest," he said. "It does exactly what you command, no more nor less." Zachariah learned to shoot standing still, then moving, then running. He learned to draw faster than thought, to reload by feel, to fire without fear. Misses earned bruises. Success earned silence. Joaquin never praised. Praise made men careless. By the end of that year, Zachariah could hit a playing card from 20 paces in seconds. Joaquin called it acceptable. The third year was worse. No weapons, no fighting, only the mind. They played chess by firelight. Joaquin forced Zachariah to think 3 moves ahead, then 5, then 10. They studied old battles, ambushes, and failures. Joaquin taught him the most dangerous skill of all, control. "Anger makes noise," Joaquin said. "Quiet men live longer." Zachariah learned to sit still for hours, breathing slow, shutting the world out. He learned to wait, to watch, to let moments come to him instead of chasing them. Revenge, Joaquin explained, wasn't fire. Fire burned fast and died young. Revenge was a coal, kept alive, hidden, patient. When the time was right, it could burn down everything. By the 4th year, the boy was gone. What remained moved like shadow and thought like a hunter. Joaquin staged trials, mock guards, false targets, sudden betrayals. Plans failed on purpose. Zachariah adapted, escaped, returned, learned. Every mistake became a lesson written into muscle and memory. On his 20th birthday, Joaquin called him to the fire one last time. "You are ready," the old man said, his voice heavy with something like regret. "But know this, every life you take will take something from you in return." Zachariah listened. He thought of his mother's songs, his sister's screams, Samuel's hanging body. "They already took everything," he said quietly. Joaquin nodded and handed him 2 ivory-handled revolvers. "Then go, but remember,
Even ghosts choose when to stop haunting. 3 days later, Zachariah left the canyon. The world would soon learn his name, or fear it. Because the moment he stepped back into Texas, the first man on his list was already drinking in a dusty saloon, unaware that the past had finally come to collect its debt. Texas had changed since Zachariah fled it as a child. The war was over, slavery was gone on paper, plantations had collapsed into dust and bitterness. But the men who once held the whip had not vanished. They had simply blended into towns, ranches, and saloons, carrying their sins like invisible scars. Zachariah returned quietly. He wore black, not as a statement, but as armor. He moved through towns without leaving stories behind, listening more than speaking. Every step west of Houston brought him closer to the first name burned into his memory: Thomas Birch. Finding him took time. Zachariah watched, asked careful questions, followed rumors whispered over whiskey and cards. Birch had drifted after the war, settling in a town called Dusty Creek, a place that smelled of sweat, smoke, and regret. He was no longer feared. He was just another drunk. Zachariah arrived at Dusty Creek on a scorching afternoon. The saloon doors creaked open, spilling noise into the street. Laughter, shouting, a piano struggling to stay alive. Inside, Birch sat at a card table near the back, thicker than before, his face bloated and red. The whip was gone. The cruelty wasn't. Zachariah stood still, letting the room feel him before he spoke. Conversations faded, chairs scraped back. A black man dressed in black with 2 revolvers didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. Zachariah walked to the table. Thomas Birch. The name landed heavy. Birch squinted, trying to focus. "Who's askin'?" "You worked as an overseer on the Whitmore plantation." Birch stiffened. His hand drifted toward his gun, slow and sloppy, too slow. "August 18th, Zachariah continued calmly. "You whipped a woman named Abigail 37 times. Recognition flickered. Fear followed. "She was my mother." The draw was invisible. One breath, Zachariah's hands were empty. The next, a barrel stared into Birch's face. Chairs toppled as men scrambled away. Silence swallowed the room. Birch began to beg. Apologies spilled out, excuses, claims of following orders. He promised he'd changed. Zachariah listened. Then he spoke softly. She begged too. The gunshot cracked through the saloon like thunder. Birch collapsed forward, cards scattering, blood soaking the table. Zachariah holstered his weapon and walked out into the blinding sunlight without looking back. By nightfall, the story had spread across Texas. A black man had executed a white man in broad daylight and vanished. Wanted posters appeared within days. They called him the Black Ghost. The bounty climbed fast. Zachariah didn't care. He was already moving. The second name was harder. William Crawford, the man who had bought Grace. Crawford lived well now. Houston streets, clean clothes, church on Sundays. No one spoke of his past. Zachariah spent weeks watching, learning routines, finding weaknesses. On a Tuesday evening, Crawford sat alone in a private club, glass in hand. Zachariah entered like smoke. Recognition came instantly. Crawford reached for help. The first bullet shattered his wrist. "Where is she?" Zachariah asked. Crawford sobbed.
He didn't know, he never remembered. Grace had been nothing to him. That truth hurt more than any lie. Zachariah ended it quickly. By morning, Texas knew the pattern. Men with hidden crimes were dying, quietly, precisely. And somewhere deep inside, the boy who once counted lashes felt something shift. Justice had a sound now, and it echoed. But with every name crossed off, Zachariah's legend grew, and soon people would begin seeking the ghost not in fear, but in hope.
Zachariah didn't notice when people started talking about him differently. At first, the stories sounded the same: whispered fear, hurried prayers, men checking their pasts the way they checked loaded chambers. But as weeks passed, something shifted. The fear stayed, yet another emotion crept in behind it: hope. In small towns across Texas, black families spoke his name like a secret blessing. Former overseers drank less. Former traders avoided the roads at night. Men who had once believed themselves untouchable suddenly remembered their sins. They called him the Black Ghost because he never stayed long enough to be seen clearly. He struck, vanished, and left nothing behind but truth. Zachariah never intended to become a symbol. He was still moving through a list, still hunting the names that lived inside him. But one night, in a town near the Brazos River, the past caught up in a way he didn't expect. He was passing through quietly when a woman stopped him in the street. She was older, her face worn thin by years of survival. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry. She simply looked at him with recognition that cut deeper than fear. "You're him," she said. Zachariah didn't answer. "My brother was lynched. The men who did it walk free. They say justice is coming, but it never does." She didn't ask him to kill them. She asked him to remember. That night, Zachariah didn't sleep. Joaquin's warning returned to him. Every life you take takes something back. He wondered how much of himself was already gone. Still, when dawn came, he rode east. The men responsible lived together on a ranch outside town. Zachariah watched for 2 days. He confirmed everything. He made sure. He always made sure. The confrontation was quick. No speeches, no cruelty, just truth delivered with finality. By the time the sun rose, 3 graves marked the edge of the ranch. The woman never learned his name, but she left flowers by the road where he had stood. After that, people began seeking him out. Runaways, widows, men who had survived chain gangs and beating posts. They didn't always ask for death. Sometimes they just wanted protection, someone the law feared more than it feared them. Zachariah became careful. He refused many. He helped some. He never stayed long. Symbols died when they stood still. The law responded as it always did. Texas Rangers were dispatched. Bounties grew larger. Newspapers printed exaggerated sketches of a monster dressed in black, armed to the teeth. They called him a threat to order. Zachariah called it balance. One night, he saved a family hiding in an abandoned church from men who intended to drag them out and make an example. When the shooting stopped, the father fell to his knees, thanking him like a savior. Zachariah turned away. "I'm not here to save anyone," he said. "I'm here to end things." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true, because sometimes ending things was the only way to protect what little good survived. Months passed, years blurred, the list grew shorter, the legend grew taller. Zachariah felt the weight of it pressing on his shoulders, the expectation, the fear, the belief. Then came the letter. It was handed to him by a trembling boy in El Paso. No name, no seal, just 3 words written in careful ink. Grace is alive. The world went silent.
For the first time in decades, Zachariah's hands shook. Because if the letter was true, everything he believed, every death, every sacrifice, would be tested by one impossible question: could the ghost become a brother again? Zachariah read the letter until the paper softened between his fingers. Grace is alive.
3 words, no explanation, no mercy. For years he had told himself his sister was gone, lost somewhere beyond reach, beyond hope. That belief had been a shield. Now it shattered, and the truth cut deeper than any blade. He burned the letter after memorizing every curve of the handwriting. Finding the truth meant stepping into danger he couldn't predict. This wasn't revenge. This was memory, fragile, painful, alive. Zachariah followed rumors north, then west, tracking whispers the way he once tracked men. A former trader spoke of a black woman working under another name in New Mexico. A preacher mentioned a woman who refused to sing hymns. A saloon owner remembered eyes that never trusted anyone. Each clue pulled him forward. Weeks later, in a dry border town near Santa Fe, he saw her. She stood outside a boarding house, hanging laundry. Older, thinner, stronger. Her hair braided tightly, her posture guarded, like someone who expected the world to strike without warning. Grace. Zachariah froze. She looked up. Their eyes met, and nothing happened. No recognition, no relief, no tears. She turned away and went inside. That hurt more than any bullet. Zachariah waited until night. He followed her carefully, keeping distance. She moved like someone trained by fear, checking shadows, listening to sounds others ignored. Whoever owned her had not broken her, but they had hardened her. He approached the boarding house door and knocked once. Silence. Then the door opened a crack. A knife glinted in her hand. "Say what you want and leave." "My name is Zachariah." The knife wavered. She studied his face, searching, years of survival warred with memory. "My mother sang, at night, about rivers and stars. You used to fall asleep before the last verse." Grace's breath caught.
"You counted lashes," she whispered. "You told me not to cry." The knife dropped. She pulled him inside and locked the door. They sat across from each other in silence, 2 survivors measuring the distance between who they were and who they'd become. Grace told her story in pieces, sold twice, beaten once, escaped once. She learned to read, learned to disappear, learned never to depend on anyone. "You became a story," she said finally. "A ghost." Zachariah nodded. "And you became my reason to keep walking." They laughed softly at that, a fragile sound neither of them trusted. For 3 days they talked, about the past, about survival, about the cost of staying alive. Grace listened as Zachariah confessed what he had done, the names he had erased. She didn't judge him. She understood him too well. On the 4th morning, Texas found him. Rangers surrounded the boarding house at dawn, guns drawn, orders shouted. Grace looked at him, calm. "They'll kill you." "Not today," he said. Zachariah led them through the back, using routes he'd mapped days earlier. Gunfire cracked the morning air. Horses screamed. Dust swallowed everything. They escaped, barely. At the edge of the desert, they stopped. Grace took his hands. "You don't belong to the past anymore," she said. "Neither of us does." Zachariah knew she was right. But some fires couldn't be left burning. Because the Rangers wouldn't stop, and the ghost's final stand would force Zachariah to choose between vengeance and the last piece of family he had left.
They rode until the land flattened into open desert, the sky stretching wide and merciless above them. Grace didn't ask where they were going. She had learned long ago that questions often led to pain. Zachariah led them toward a place Joaquin once called the quiet edge of the world, a region few traveled and fewer survived. But the rangers were relentless. By the second day, dust plumes rose on the horizon, horses, men, steel-backed law with orders that didn't include mercy. Grace noticed first. "They won't stop," she said. "No, they won't."
They reached a rocky canyon by dusk, its walls tall and jagged, wind howling through narrow passes. Zachariah dismounted and studied the land, his mind moving through possibilities. He could fight, he could kill, he could disappear again. But Grace would never stop running. That night they argued in whispers beside a low fire. "You don't owe the world anything," Grace said. "Not justice, not balance, not blood." Zachariah stared into the flames. "If I walk away now, everything I did becomes meaningless." "Or maybe," she said gently, "it becomes enough." The words stayed with him as he lay awake listening to the wind. At dawn, the rangers arrived. Zachariah sent Grace deeper into the canyon with a single horse and what supplies he could spare. She resisted, gripping his coat like she had as a child. "You promised," she said. "I promised to find you, not to doom you." They held each other once, tight, brief, necessary. Then she was gone. Zachariah climbed higher, choosing ground that forced the rangers into narrow paths. The first shots rang out as the sun rose. Dust exploded, men fell, horses screamed. He moved like the canyon itself, appearing, vanishing, striking from angles that made no sense. The rangers were trained, disciplined, but they were chasing a legend that refused to stand still. Hours passed, ammunition dwindled, bodies littered the rocks. Finally, a voice echoed through the canyon. "Zachariah!" He recognized the speaker, Captain Eli Mercer, a man known for surviving battles others didn't. Mercer stepped forward alone, rifle lowered. "This ends today," Mercer called. "Walk away and your sister lives free. Fight and she'll never stop running." Zachariah considered it. Then he stepped into view. "I'll walk, but the ghost stays." They met at the canyon's mouth. Mercer watched him carefully, seeing not a monster, but a tired man.
Zachariah laid his guns on the ground. Then he turned and walked into the desert, unarmed, unchained, unseen. The rangers never fired. By nightfall, Zachariah was gone. Grace reached a small settlement days later. She waited. He never came. Weeks passed, months. Texas kept telling stories of a black gunslinger who vanished into legend, leaving justice behind like a footprint in sand. Grace built a quiet life. She married. She sang. Not hymns, but songs of survival. Sometimes she swore she saw a man in black watching from a distance, always leaving before she could reach him. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was memory. But somewhere beyond the reach of law and vengeance, Zachariah finally rested, not as a ghost, not as a weapon, but as a man who chose love over fire. Yet legends never truly die, and years later a single gunshot would echo across Texas, forcing the world to ask whether the ghost had ever truly left at all. Years passed the way they always do, quietly for those who survive, loudly for those who remember. Texas tried to forget the black ghost. Newspapers stopped printing his name. Rangers grew old.
New laws replaced old ones, towns expanded, railroads carved through dust, and men pretended the past had been buried. But legends don't fade, they wait. One autumn evening in a town called Red Hollow, a gunshot cracked through the air at exactly 9:30 p.m. It was a clean sound, deliberate, final. The saloon emptied in seconds. A man lay dead near the bar, his blood spreading slowly across the wooden floor. He was well dressed, respected, and powerful, a former militia officer turned landowner named Jonathan Pike. By morning, whispers spread. Pike had once led a night raid against freed families after the war. Witnesses had vanished, evidence had disappeared. He had built his fortune on silence, and now he was dead. No one saw who fired the shot, but on the wall behind the bar, carved lightly into the wood, was a symbol most Texans hoped never to see again, a simple black mark shaped like a hollow circle.
The ghost. Grace heard the story weeks later. She was older now, living peacefully far from Texas, raising children who knew nothing of chains or whips. When the rumor reached her, she felt the past stir like a sleeping storm. That night, she dreamed of Zachariah standing at the edge of firelight, watching, waiting. She never spoke his name aloud again. Back in Texas, fear returned. Men with buried crimes left town. Others locked doors early. Rangers investigated, but they found nothing. No tracks, no witnesses, only a pattern. Men who deserved justice dying quietly in places where the law had once failed. Some said the ghost had returned. Others said the legend had inspired someone new. Zachariah watched from afar. He was older, slower, scarred by time, but his eyes remained sharp, his movements precise. He no longer hunted lists. He responded only when the silence grew too heavy to ignore. Jonathan Pike hadn't been on any list, but his actions had called out into the dark. Zachariah left Red Hollow that same night, traveling light, leaving no trail. He crossed into territories where his name meant nothing, where he could be just another shadow passing through. At a small river crossing days later, he stopped and washed his hands. The water ran clear, carrying nothing with it. He looked at his reflection, a man shaped by pain, but no longer owned by it. For the first time, he felt no fire, only resolve. Zachariah knew the world would always need stories like his, not to glorify violence, but to remind power that it was never absolute, that memory had teeth. He walked until the land opened wide and the stars came out, the same stars his mother once sang about. Somewhere far away, Grace sang too, and Texas slept uneasily, knowing that if darkness ever grew too bold again, the ghost would remember. But the final truth behind the black ghost would only be revealed decades later, when a forgotten journal surfaced, forcing history to confront the man behind the legend. The fire was supposed to erase everything. It tore through the old homestead outside San Angelo in a single night, leaving nothing but blackened beams and smoke curling into the dawn. The land had belonged to a reclusive man who lived alone, spoke little, and paid in cash. No family came forward, no records remained. But fires have a strange way of revealing truths instead of hiding them. When the rubble cooled, a worker clearing debris found something wrapped in oilcloth beneath a fallen floorboard. A leather-bound journal, scorched at the edges, but intact. No name marked the cover. Inside, the handwriting was careful, controlled, patient. The first entry was dated decades earlier. I write so I don't forget who I was before the world taught me how to become something else. The journal passed quietly from hand to hand before reaching a historian who understood what she was reading. The entries didn't brag, they didn't glorify blood. They spoke of nights without sleep, of choices weighed like stones, of lives spared as often as lives taken. And always, between the lines, ran grief. The writer described a mother who sang, a sister with bright eyes, a friend who believed in freedom even while hanging from a tree. He never used their names, but the details were unmistakable.
One passage stood out. I am not justice. I am a reminder. Justice should have come long before I was needed. The final entries were shorter, slower, as if age pressed against the words. I have learned that vengeance burns hot and dies loud. Love burns quiet and lasts longer. If my sister ever reads this, I hope she knows I chose her. There was no final confession, no list of names, just one last sentence written shakily across the final page. Let the ghost end with me. When the historian published excerpts, Texas reacted the only way it knew how, with argument. Some called him a murderer. Others called him a necessary evil. Many refused to believe the ghost had ever been real. But a few details silenced the doubt. Dates matched disappearances, locations matched crimes long denied, and at the back of the journal, folded carefully, was a pressed wildflower, the kind that grew only near one small settlement in New Mexico, Grace's settlement. She never claimed the journal, but one evening, long after the fire and the headlines faded, a woman was seen standing near the burned homestead at sunset. She stayed only a moment, laying a single flower on the ground before leaving without a word. The wind carried the ashes away. Texas kept moving forward, pretending its past had been settled. But stories like Zachariah's don't disappear. They live in margins, in warnings, in quiet understanding. Because sometimes history isn't changed by laws or speeches. Sometimes it's changed by someone who refuses to forget. And somewhere beyond memory, the black ghost finally rested. Not feared, not hunted, not worshipped, just remembered. Yet one question remained unanswered. Was Zachariah truly gone, or had he left behind something even more dangerous than a legend? For most people, the journal was the end of the story. A burned house, a nameless man, a legend explained and laid to rest. Texas preferred endings like that, clean, quiet, and far away from responsibility.
But for a few, the journal felt less like a conclusion and more like a warning. In the years that followed its discovery, something subtle began to change. It didn't make headlines. It didn't announce itself. It moved the way Zachariah always had, patient, deliberate, almost invisible. Men with violent pasts began leaving town without explanation. Property records were quietly corrected. Witnesses who had stayed silent for decades suddenly found the courage to speak. Old cases reopened themselves, not through force, but through memory. People started calling it coincidence. Others called it the ghost's shadow. Grace lived long enough to see the shift. She recognized it immediately. The world had not learned kindness, It had learned accountability, and that distinction mattered. She told her grandchildren stories without names, stories about choosing when to fight and when to walk away, about how hatred could protect you once, but love was the only thing that saved you twice. When she passed, there was no public notice, just a small gathering, just music, just peace. Meanwhile, across Texas and beyond, people found copies of the journal circulating in unexpected places: churches, schools, even law offices. The words didn't inspire violence, they inspired restraint. I am not justice, I am a reminder. That sentence was underlined again and again. Young men read it and learned patience instead of rage. Old men read it and felt something like shame. The story became less about a gunman and more about what happens when justice is delayed too long. Historians argued over whether Zachariah had intended this legacy. Some said he only wanted revenge. Others believed he understood exactly what he was doing when he wrote those final pages. The truth was simpler. He had lived long enough to know that fear fades, but ideas don't. One evening, years after Grace's death, a young teacher discovered something odd while cataloging donated books. Tucked inside a journal's back cover was a handwritten note written in the same careful script. If you are reading this, then I trusted you to choose better than I did. No signature. The teacher never told anyone where the note came from. She simply kept it with her, letting it guide her work. Zachariah had once believed violence was the only language power understood. By the end, he had learned something else, that stories, when told honestly, could outlive bullets. The ghost had ended. The echo had not. And Texas, whether it wanted to or not, carried his story forward, not as a threat, but as a mirror. Because the most dangerous thing Zachariah ever left behind wasn't a gun or a name or a legend. It was memory. And in the final chapter, we return to the beginning, to the song his mother sang, and the quiet truth that explains everything the ghost ever became. Long before the gunshots, before the running, before the name Ghost ever existed, there was a song. It wasn't written down. It didn't belong to any church or book. It lived only in the breath of a tired woman rocking her children through the night, humming softly so the masters wouldn't hear. Abigail's song had no single melody. It shifted, bending with feeling. Some nights it sounded hopeful. Other nights it trembled like it might fall apart. But it always ended the same way. Slow, steady, certain. God remembers. Zachariah had carried that song longer than he realized. Even when his mother died, the melody stayed. Even when Grace was taken, it echoed faintly in the back of his mind. During the years of hunger, the training, the killing, the song never left. It simply changed shape. It became patience. It became restraint. It became the reason he didn't shoot when anger begged him to. Near the end of his life, Zachariah lived quietly near a river far from Texas. No one there knew who he had been. To them, he was just an older man who fixed fences, spoke kindly, and kept to himself. Sometimes, children sat nearby while he worked. They liked his voice. It was calm, safe. One evening, a little girl asked him to sing. Zachariah froze. "I don't sing," he said. She waited anyway. The river flowed beside them, slow and patient. The sky burned orange as the sun dipped low. For the first time in decades, Zachariah felt the weight lift just enough to breathe. He hummed. The sound startled him, thin at first, uncertain, then steadier, familiar.
The song his mother sang returned, not as pain, but as peace. The girl smiled. "What's it about?" she asked. Zachariah thought for a long time. "It's about remembering," he finally said, "and being remembered the right way." That night he wrote one last page, not in a journal, not for history, but for himself. "I was never meant to be a weapon. I was meant to survive."
Everything I became was shaped by what the world refused to fix. If there is forgiveness, let it begin where the harm began, in memory. When Zachariah passed, there was no violence, no chase, no legend rising to reclaim him, just quiet breath fading into night, the river carrying on as it always had. The people who buried him marked no name on the grave. They didn't need one. Years later, a traveler passing through heard a woman singing by the river, a simple tune, old and soft, passed down through generations. No one knew where it came from, only that it made people stop and listen. The ghost had never been about death. He had been about remembering the cost of forgetting, and as long as the song survived, so would the truth. In the final part, we confront the last unanswered question, whether Zachariah's story truly ended with him, or if the canon of darkness was only just beginning. Stories don't end the way people expect. They don't close with gunshots or last words carved in stone. Most of the time, they fade the way breath does on a cold night, slowly, quietly, until only warmth remains. Years after Zachariah was laid into the earth beside the river, no one spoke his name, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer needed to be said. His story had settled into something deeper than legend. It had become understanding. Texas kept changing. New generations grew up without chains, without overseers, without the old excuses spoken so confidently in the past. But darkness didn't disappear. It never does. It only waits for people to forget. And that was why Zachariah mattered. Not as the black ghost, not as a gunman, but as proof that memory could be sharper than any blade. In a courthouse decades later, a young lawyer argued a case involving stolen land and erased records. When asked why she wouldn't let the matter rest, she answered simply, "Because someone once paid for this silence with their life." She had never heard Zachariah's name. She didn't need to. In a small Texas town, an elderly man refused to join a mob calling for violence after a crime. He said, "We don't become what we hate," though he couldn't remember where he'd first learned those words. They came from the journal, from the song, from the echo. Somewhere far from Texas, a woman stood by a river teaching her granddaughter a melody passed down through blood and survival. The child asked why the song sounded sad and strong at the same time. The woman smiled.
"Because it remembers," she said. "If you searched old records, you'd never find Zachariah listed as a hero. You'd find no statue, no official apology tied to his name. History rarely honors the people who force it to look at itself. But in the quiet moments, when men chose restraint over cruelty, when truth was spoken instead of buried, when power hesitated because it felt watched, that was where he lived. The canon of darkness was never about evil. It was about what happens when darkness is named, remembered, and refused the right to rule unchecked. Zachariah had walked through fire so others wouldn't have to. He had carried hate long enough to understand its weight, and then laid it down when it threatened to consume what little good remained. That was his final victory. Not the men he killed, not the fear he inspired, but the moment he chose love over vengeance and walked away. If legends are warnings, then Zachariah's was clear. When justice fails, darkness grows teeth. When memory survives, darkness loses its grip. And somewhere beyond the reach of time, a boy listens to his mother sing beneath a sky full of stars, not afraid, not angry, not hunted, just free. The story ends there, not with a gunshot, but with a song.